The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning and thanks for joining us for today's webinar regarding the impact on the assistance that DLP and insider threat technologies can have in GDPR compliance. And thanks very much for joining us. I'm delighted to be joined today by Mike Smart, the Product and Solutions Director at our Platinum partner Forcepoint, who have a long history of aiding businesses with data protection, and so a really fantastic resource to educate us around some of the policies and solutions that are available to assist in compliance. Hopefully you can all hear me. If there, in the event of any audio or screen problems, please do put comments across via the questions in the chat box, and I will make sure those are rectified. Just to give you a little bit of context behind what we're going to present today, a little bit of an agenda. So a bit of housekeeping first, we'll do a quick introduction to Bytes. I will keep it short, as many of you know it already. A little bit of scene setting around GDPR, just a recap really of the salient points around it that information security teams need to know. And then I'll hand over to Mike Smart from Forcepoint, who will be doing the bulk of today's presentation. He'll take us through a bit around GDPR and data loss prevention, how that assists in providing assistance in compliance, a bit of a focus on insider threats and how those can be dealt with within organisations, give you a very brief overview of some of the Forcepoint, DLP and insider threat solutions, and then we will run an interactive Q&A at the end of the session. So a little bit of housekeeping. So attendee lines will be on mute throughout today's presentation, but we do welcome and encourage questions throughout, so please, we'll do a full Q&A at the end. So please, as they occur to you, or questions box, and I will pose them to Mike at the end. In terms of the rules of engagement for today's session, we are not going to be discussing commercials or pricing or going into long demos on this session. We're keeping it to strategic solutions and issues during this session. Of course, we are more than happy to have those discussions post-webinar just to set your expectations for today. We will make a recording available and also make the webinar slides available to you all post-session so that you can share that insight with your teams. And we do have a feedback survey at the end. It's a short 6-question survey which we use in order to make sure that these educational sessions continue to hit the mark. So I would please encourage you to take the time to fill that in at the end of the session. So who are we? Who are Bytes Security Partnerships? So we are an independent security reseller within the Bytes technology group, which is part of the multi-billion Allied Electronics group. And we've been focusing on security solely for over 16 years, so we serve as a real specialist. And as part of that, a core part of our business is the technical expertise and insight that we provide to customers and prospects. We have an in-house team of fully accredited engineers on all of the technologies that we sell, and we offer a full suite of technology consultancy services, maintenance, installation, and 24/7 support. We are fortunate enough, due to that, to enjoy top-tier vendor partnerships with the likes of Forcepoint, who we're a platinum partner for, and we have been for some years. And part of the reason that we retain that status year on year is that we have an in-house support team who have escalation level third line engineers on every call. So we add value to customers and Forcepoint by resolving technical issues in-house wherever possible, rather than doing any tiny vendor escalation. So where do we work? We work across the whole suite of security, from network security, firewalling, through content and data loss prevention security. We look at application security, access and authentication, and then very relevantly, we have a specialism in looking at data loss prevention and data theft prevention technologies. That gives you a flavour of where we work. Within all of these areas, we offer a full suite of security services, starting with support. We do technology delivery, installation and maintenance, training and in-house education for your teams. We also are involved with our customers in developing their security strategy and assessing their technology roadmap. So that's just a flavour of some of the services that Bytes Security Partnerships provide. So enough about us. On to GDPR. So why is GDPR a game changer? Why is it raising headlines, and why are people so keen to find out more about it? First main point is that it not only extends the remit of the existing Data Protection Act and Data Protection Directive, but it also adds significant new obligations for those. The first of which is that the EU regulation will apply regardless of our company. So it is regardless of territory that you're based in. If you process EU citizen personal data, then GDPR essentially trumps your local regulations and needs to be complied with. So UK specifically, in or out, Brexit-wise, the same rules apply. Not only will the GDPR come in prior to Brexit coming into place, but also the UK government were involved in such a large piece of writing the existing legislation that even post-Brexit, very little is likely to change. So the fines, not wanting to scaremonger, but the fines are significant, up to 4% of global revenue. If you're part of a smaller business, it's part of a larger group, that is the global revenue that applies. So that really could be business critical should you be found to be non-compliant. It is one of the few pieces of legislation where businesses are required to take a really interdepartmental approach. So security operations, IT, legal, the whole board needs to be aware of this and be able to ensure that in their different ways they are supporting compliance. Customers for the first time have the right to be forgotten, the right to have the data erased. That has technical implications on how you would actually collect the consent to process the data in the first place, and ensure that should a customer request to be forgotten and have the data erased, you know all the points that where the data is held and you can actually process that for them. This is a journey. There are no silver bullets. There are very different ways and strategies to achieve compliance. There aren't any silver bullets. It does need a holistic approach. However, solutions do exist to aid compliance in different ways, and data loss prevention technology is a core part of that. So with that in mind, I'm delighted to introduce Mike Smart. Mike is the Product and Solutions Director at Forcepoint. Forcepoint are the global Gartner market leader in content security and data loss prevention for now 7 years now. So we've been working with them for over 10 years as a platinum partner. They have decades of experience in aiding organizations in designing strong data security policies and solutions. And over the last couple of years have invested heavily in the data security space, adding digital forensics and insider threat solutions to their classic existing data loss prevention data security portfolio. So most companies now are starting to understand the basics of the legislation, so we will do a very quick recap when Mike comes on the line. What we want to do today is really focus in on the practicalities of ensuring data privacy. How do businesses create policies and enforce policies and deliver solutions that protect personal data from external and internal threats? Without further ado, I'll hand over to Mike. Mike will be taking you through a brief presentation about 30 minutes, and then, as I said, we'll be running a Q&A at the end. We'd be delighted to take your questions at the end.
Absolutely. Thank you, Shona. Appreciate that. We're just going to switch over so that you can see my slides. Just to confirm that's okay. Shona, can you see the slides now?
It is indeed.
Great. Excellent. Right. Thanks very much, Shona. And you absolutely are in safe hands with Bytes in terms of a real trusted partner of ours. They really know our technology and provide some very valuable services around that to make it much easier for you to adopt and manage our technologies in an ongoing manner. And it is my pleasure to be here today to talk to you about this, and it's a follow-up actually from a session that a colleague of mine, Neil Thacker, presented a few weeks ago now. And so I thought For those of you that perhaps have turned up to this one but weren't able to attend the event in person a few weeks ago, I've got a handful of slides, less than a handful of slides, just to sort of recap and remind those of what we talked about in our session. Just like anything, I suppose, we have to be careful, how we position what we say, especially when you talk about regulations, because of course what we don't want to do is to be providing legal advice where we shouldn't. And so this really is just a disclaimer to tell you that, I'm going to give you some information about GDPR and some information about, the activities and the tasks you should be looking to do to become or work towards GDPR compliance. But you definitely don't see this as legal advice, and we definitely recommend that you contact your own legal or compliance teams in order to get the advice that you need specifically for your organisation. So that's the legal thing out of the way. Another thing that you will have seen from Neil, and it's a useful one to show everybody, is what the Information Commissioner's Office, the ICO, have issued in terms of guidance and advice. And over the next few months and quarters, you'll see more advice coming out around GDPR in terms of some of the more specific areas of the regulation. I've had the fortunate task of reading the journal that surrounds that regulation, and it's 100 and something pages, with well over 140 different recitals, and I think it's around about 80 or 90 individual articles. And there's a lot in there. One of the things that's interesting is that there's very little in terms of prescriptive advice around technology or information security. It can be quite high level, and there will be more and more guidance coming. But what I've done is I've taken that investment of my time and I've mapped quite a lot of those articles to some of the information security elements, if you like, that will be more relevant to the audience listening in today. But let's look at a couple of these points here. These are things that we should all be doing now around GDPR. Whilst it does come into effect on the 28th of May, I think it is 2018, or 25th of May, I think it is actually. That feels like a long time away, but it's not very long, and it'll go very quickly. There's a number of things, and Shona very eloquently talked about, the fact that this should be a board level issue, an awareness and raising awareness. If it isn't already there as part of that as a business risk, or on your risk matrix, then it should be, because it's a very important thing that impacts the whole organisation, with or without information security or IT. You definitely need to understand what information you're holding, and you need to be updating your privacy notices that you provide when people visit the website or interact with you as an organisation. You certainly should be looking at the individual's rights, and in fact, if you keep customer records, you don't own those records. The individual whose that personal data belongs to actually kind of owns that data and has rights to that data. So you need to be able to facilitate those rights, the subject access requests that will be coming in as a result of this regulation. You need to be clear as to what your legal basis is for processing personal data, and you shouldn't over-process, either store things for too long or capture too much data, and there's very specific guidance around profiling information, for marketing purposes. So it's very, very restrictive in terms of some of that. There's very specific guidance around children, and personal data is only relevant to those that are still living, by the way, so that's just another little fact. You should be ready for the data breaches and et cetera, et cetera. So there's a lot going on here, and a lot of that isn't technology related, by the way. It's business process, the sort of softer side of IT, I suppose. What Neil also talked about was climbing a mountain. Now, I wasn't there, so I can't really comment exactly what he said here, but I do know what he meant here, and that is it is like climbing a mountain moving towards GDPR compliance. And in fact, there are often false peaks where you think you're there, but you're not quite. But the reality is, you do need to very soon get to a sort of base camp where you can, deal with the early stuff, understanding where your data is, understanding how that data is flowing, and fixing certain broken business processes, for example, around data, and getting yourself ready, for the next climb, if you like, towards GDPR compliance. Things like contractual reviews, looking at your suppliers, making sure they're doing they've got their own policies and processes around protecting the personal data. In the past, as a processor and as a controller of personal data, if you chose to outsource some of that through a cloud-based service, then you could often offload some of the responsibility. With the GDPR, that's not the case. You still own and are responsible for that personal data, regardless of who you choose to share that with. So, of course, there's a real focus now on organizations looking to appoint suppliers to understand exactly what they do around the protection of personal data, what controls, what mechanisms they have around physical and digital security. And as a supplier ourselves, we do cloud-based services. We are also very serious on this, and we have things like the ISO certification 27001 and 27018, which is a specific subset of that, focused just on the protection of personal and identifiable information, as well as other certification standards like the Cloud Security Alliance STAR certification, for example. Anyway, moving swiftly on, this is a sort of simplified roadmap, if you like, or timeline of what organizations are doing over and above and moving towards GDPR compliance. And most organizations have already got to the stage of preparation, and that's really about making sure you've got a data protection officer appointed, and you can have somebody that's built, that's in-house, or you can even choose to provide or to employ a contractor or somebody external to the organization that specializes in this to help you build your policies and your processes. You should definitely review the responsibilities for your controller and processor, and you should be looking at where personal information, personal data is within the organization, because it's always somewhere you're not expecting it to be, by the way. Within 12 months of the regulation, 25th of May, you should be looking at how the data is being processed, not just, and processed means stored as well as used and accessed. And so data flow, mapping that out, understanding who has access to it and where it's going is going to be an important piece, that contractual review. And something else that came out of the general data protection regulation is the need to do data protection impact assessments. And that's a process to be able to perform when you're implementing something new, a new process or a new piece of technology, to understand what impact that has on the personal data, for example. And then once you've gone through that phase, if you like, you're able to then put together an action list to mitigate and minimize the impact on that personal data. And then lastly, when you get to that stage of the build-up of the 25th of May, when it comes into force, then you should be looking to have updated your technical and organizational controls and be ready to do this response within the 72-hour period of the controller being aware that a data breach has occurred. You've got to be ready for those subject access requests, where individuals will be looking to say, I want you to remove my data, where you can, depending on, there's various different circumstances as to why, how you should and when you should be able to remove that data. And they often will be looking to get data out of you and be able to take it somewhere else if there's a new supplier that they're moving towards, for example. Okay, so we've looked at the regulation and we've kind of analysed some key use cases, I suppose, where technology can play an important part. And it's really clear to say, just as Shona said right at the beginning of this session, there is no silver bullet in terms of technology. You can't just buy DLP and tick the compliance box. It's much more than that, a lot more, unfortunately. But DLP is a primary technical measure for a very good reason, and that is because it's very data-centric. It understands data, and you'll see that in my session today. But we've also looked at other areas where technology can play a part. The first one being maintaining a personal data inventory. But also it can assist and is relevant around data protection impact assessments as well. So technologies like DLP and other insider threat technologies, because they collect very personal data or even capture personal data in the logs, for example, or about the individuals processing that information, that's a concern for organizations. And so anonymizing that data is one way of mitigating the risk to personal data, and that would come up in a data protection impact assessment. Okay, so there's lots of tools that we've created as an organisation, and other organisations have created to assist you to understand what this means to you if you're in the information security or information technology teams, because actually you do have a role to play. But is it your responsibility to become compliant? Hopefully not, but it depends on the size of the organisation as to which role you take or how many different roles you have in the compliance process. But this is a paper that we sponsored with Osterman, and it came with some research, and obviously no surprise here, but the most popular technical measure, as it's referred to in the regulation, around moving and helping organisations to become compliant is DLP, for the very reason that it understands data and it provides that visibility of data as well. So let's sort of go through the 3 use cases that I'm going to talk about today, and that is where DLP or data-centric technologies can really play an important part in terms of assisting organisations towards climbing that mountain that is the GDPR compliance. The first one is the inventory of personal data. You need to know where your data is at rest, where's it stored, and also who has access to that information, maybe when was it last modified, for example. These are important pieces, and it's an important step to take at the beginning of the journey, of course, but also as you're going through the journey and when you get out the other side, and the ongoing management of that too. And it's probably important to note that, personal data isn't just where you think it is as well. So let's sort of go into the personal data. We've got into 3 stages for this session. You need to understand a lot of people are using data inventory, personal data inventory right now. It's a very sort of hot topic for us and for Bytes as a way of understanding how big is my GDPR effort, compliance effort, where is my data, and what can I do in the short term to kind of reduce what I call the attack surface. It's the attack surface from an outsider trying to get in to that data, but also from an insider user, accidentally, providing that information out, or even maliciously taking that information. Because if you can reduce where the data is and how much access there is to that data, you've really minimized quite a lot of what you have to protect in the first place. So let's look at the sort of regulation. I'm not going to go into massive detail here, and you have access to the slides at the end of this session. But there are specific articles and specific chapters that are really relevant to the need to inventory personal data. There are, in Chapter 2, the basic principles, if you like. In Section 3, it's really about the owner of that personal data, the constituent, if you like, the citizen or the consumer. They have various rights: the right to erasure, or right to be forgotten, the right for data portability, or the right for rectification. That means for them to say, no, you've got my details wrong, you need to correct it, for example. So that's an important piece, because you need to find that data, of course. The second area is Chapter 4, which is more around the obligations of the controller and the processor, and that is that they need to implement appropriate technical and organisational measures to ensure and to be able to demonstrate that processing is performed in accordance with this regulation. So processing isn't just using the data, it's also storing the data, putting it into rest. And then Chapter 5 is a massive section with articles 44 to 50, which is really about data and the allowing or blocking the flow of data to what they call third countries or international organisations outside of the EU. It's not impossible to do that. You just have to make sure that if you do it, you put in the policies and the processes and the checks with the organisation you're choosing to share that information with, for example. So if we look at some of the challenges with, the discovery or the inventory of personal data, I kind of think that it falls into 3 areas, really. They're subtle ones, actually. Obviously, data isn't just where you can point at it. In the good old days, you had a file server and you could say, well, that's where my data is. But even then, it wasn't just there. It would be on a desktop machine, for example. And the reality is nowadays is that it's even worse than that, in that you do have already supplier relationships. You do share physical and digital information with those suppliers, and you also have perhaps cloud-based applications that you weren't aware of that users are using to be more productive, where potentially personal data also resides. So it's not an easy easy task. There's data in email systems, obviously, and on-premise and cloud-based storage too. And don't forget the mobile workforce, where you've got laptop users taking personal data outside, or thumb drives. So it's everywhere. You also find that data isn't easy to find either. And what I mean by that, I suppose, is that you need to look for data in different ways depending on the type of data it is. And so I've got sort of 3 sections here, but the way that technology understands and profiles data is different depending on the type of data. So for example, you can describe the data you want to look for. For example, credit cards have a certain pattern to them, national insurance IDs, those sorts of things, even postal codes. You can use a pattern recognition approach, which means you don't have to have every single potential credit card number or national insurance ID. You just need to know the pattern to look for so that you can pick those up. But even then, that's not straightforward. You need some sort of validation that you have got, in fact, a credit card number, and not just a random set of numbers. Then there's the learned approach, which is show me some personal data and I'll look for that, or I'll look for parts of that data somewhere else. And that's typically what we use fingerprinting technology is used for. And of course, data itself can be in a structured format, like a database or a spreadsheet, where particular columns have particular values in, and that's easier to find, of course, versus unstructured, where it could be a Word document, a PowerPoint, or even an image where personal information resides, and it's not in a certain place. You have to look across the whole document, and even fragments of that information within that document. And then in terms of scanning the files and tracking those files, there are 2 approaches. There's the file tagging, which is if it comes from this place or is created in this way, we're going to classify it or tag it as, I don't know, confidential. And that's okay, but it doesn't know what's inside that. So often you might have a file that is confidential or tagged as confidential that isn't, or vice versa. You false positive, false negative approach. And so you want to kind of combine maybe those 2 with being able to look inside the file and see where that personal data is. And then of course the last point to move quickly on to is that data isn't just lost, it's often stolen as well. So you need to be able to look for it even when it's sort of obfuscated or hidden, because somebody malicious, an outsider or an insider, is trying to steal that information. If you're losing it, they don't realize they're doing it, and so it's out in the open. And so there's lots of different ways of seeing that information, even if it's trying to be hidden in terms of that transaction. But that's more of a data flow issue versus a data at rest issue. Oh, and by the way, there is lots of technologies in terms of DLP, but it's typically known as DLP Discover. That's the ability to scan various locations for personal data. And then endpoint DLP is an important piece too, because data isn't just on the network where you have access to it. It might be off the network on those laptop devices, for example. Another thing to note here is that any sort of technology you're deploying, you're going to have to program it to look for that information. So any time where an organization has got a research team that have taken the time to develop and predefine policies that'll help you understand, profile, classify, or discover and get visibility of that personal data, is going to save a huge amount of time in terms of deployment, but also ongoing point of view. And so for us, we have policies ready to go for things like GDPR and personal identifiable information. And of course, that isn't just limited to the GDPR, it's also limited to particular information types you'd find in certain verticals and industries, or different information types like medical information versus just personal data, for example. So if you were to run a data discovery, this is the sort of results that you'd find. You'd be able to see where that data exists and what type of data store or data discovery mechanism was used to find it. This is very important to sort of see where it is and how far it's made its way across your organization. And you're able to look at specific files that you found or incidents to be able to understand exactly what the file is, the properties of that file when it was created or last accessed, but also access control. And that will vary depending on where you found it, of course, as to what level of access control is available. And of course, you're able to look at the file itself and understand, is that really personal information, or is it something that maybe misclassified because it was tagged incorrectly, for example. So these are all ways of being able to sort of drill down into it. But one thing I would say before I move on to the next section is the reality is we absolutely do have to work with all of the different functions within the business, so cross-functional if you like, to help, to work with them to understand their information, because as an IT or an information security person, we may not understand what really is sensitive data or personal data, and they're best placed to know that. So you often will ask them, where do you think your data is? Who do you think's processing, accessing that data and storing that data? And this is a great way of validating that's exactly where it is. And by the way, whenever we or Bytes come in to do some sort of data risk assessment, we'll always find data in the wrong place. And so fixing those things early on can make a real difference. So the next one is the need to monitor, manage, control personal data flows. And reality is that we're here to make sure, this sort of approach is to make sure that personal data is being processed and being used within the policies created and implemented. And also it's a great way of managing the flow of data outside of the organization and outside of the organization's control, if you like. So again, just like the first section, there are various pieces that really apply to the mapping of data flow. Obviously Article 24 we've covered already, so I won't go into that. And Article 25 is, talking about, processing the information, applying the right measures, but also now they're talking about specific approaches to minimizing the scope of the regulation. So pseudonymization took me a while to practice that word, but this is the ability of detaching the person from the information, whether it's through tokenization or randomization or whatever it is. But the idea is to say, look, we can process this information because you can't map it back to an individual, and therefore it's no longer personal information or personal data, and it's not subject to the regulation. So a lot of marketing or retail organizations, or any organization, I guess, is looking at these types of approaches to minimize the risk to the individual. Chapter 4, Article 32, really is talking about, now we're talking about technical measures and organizational measures around the protection of personal data. And so you'll see, for example, there is sort of conversations here around CIA, confidentiality, integrity and availability, traditional IT and information security approaches and methodologies and terminology. Chapter 5, we've talked about this. This is transferring of data to third countries and international organizations. So just like when we talked about discovery of data, there are things to consider when we're talking about monitoring the flow of data. And again, I guess back to my point is that, you don't have to have technology to understand your data flows. You just have to talk to those lines of business that have access to and are processing personal data. And so a good proportion of your GDPR project should be face-to-face workshops with the different functions within the business. But obviously DLP, because it understands data and can see that data as it flows across the organization, then it's clearly an advantageous tool. So of course data flows across the network, and so you'll need something to see that data as it's flowing across the network. So gateway-based DLP or network-based DLP is what we would typically see there. And of course the great thing about DLP is that you can use your discovery or your visibility of that information to change or make a policy decision. So that policy decision may be to allow that data to flow across the network, maybe via email, but to apply, say, encryption to that because it is sensitive and we need to secure it as it goes to the correct recipient within a supplier that we've authorized or have validated and done some due diligence with, for example. But of course you do need to have, and one of the fastest growing areas for DLP is the endpoint, mainly because the endpoint isn't always on the network. It might be off the network, and you still need to protect, manage and get visibility of personal data being processed there too. And so there it's really about data in motion as they open files, as they create files, as they manipulate files. That's data in use, I suppose. And as they then start to share those files with other things like maybe file sync and share, or OneNote, or whatever, Evernote. There's various different technologies that they might use that you haven't sanctioned perhaps, or you have sanctioned, and that personal data might make its way onto another network or another organization's infrastructure. And that's important to maintain that visibility and control as well, and obviously removable media. But there's another area, the cloud, which is an important piece too, because of course you may well choose to integrate cloud technology. It's obviously a popular growth area because it can be lots of benefits, including cost savings as well as innovation and creativity. But the reality is you need to understand how much cloud is being used and how much of that you knew about and you've applied policies around, and how much of those you haven't. So discovery of cloud application usage is a key part of this, but also being able to monitor what's being put into those sanctioned applications is very much important. And actually the endpoint can play a part here, because it knows it's processing sensitive data and it's trying to go to an unapproved location. Then you could provide sort of blocking mechanisms. But if you know it's going to the right location, you might want to control exactly what data gets put there and how. And there's a newish sort of trend out there, which is cloud application security brokers. It's a term that's used for technologies that are there to sit between the user and the cloud application to control flow of information and manage the level of access to particular applications, for example, and authentication. So that's a technology you might consider. And DLP itself plays a part in that CASB marketplace. So looking at data in motion, I mean, this is a good slide to kind of highlight exactly how and why DLP works quite well, but you don't have to have DLP to understand what's going on here. And that is, we work with different functions, who, on the column on the left. So we're picking on human resources because they absolutely have very sensitive and personal data, in fact, very critical data too. And so in this example, we would say, well, we know they have access to that, so we're not going to restrict that piece of it, but we can look at what they're doing with that personal data. So where are they trying to put that data? In this case, it's Dropbox via the web. Well, that's a high risk because Dropbox is not a sanctioned application. We can block that with very minimal risk to the business as well. In terms of human resources accessing personal approved business partner, and they're choosing to email it, and that's okay, but we're going to encrypt it to make sure that that transaction end-to-end is a safe one and protects that data. Again, pretty low risk, pretty simple to deploy. And then the last one is where it's sort of a grey area, or an amber area in this case, which is sales and marketing. They know their customers, of course. Now, this particular salesperson wants to put their customer records onto removable media. Now, doesn't sound good, but as an IT person, who am I to approve or disallow that function? And so in which case we might want to confirm it rather than block it, because it's important for maybe that business unit to continue to function regardless, and we'll take an element of risk in allowing that to happen. But by providing that sales rep or that individual the chance to decide, is that really what you want to do? They'll 9 times out of 10 will make the right decision anyway. So here's an example of a report, looking at the flow of data, and so those incidents that help us map out and understand that flow of sensitive data. So you need to know who's sending the data, what channel they're sending it over. So is it, over email, or is it a web, or is it, cloud-based file sync and share, or is it on the endpoint? Where is it going? And what action was taken? Was it allowed? Was it quarantined if it was an email, for example, or was it deleted in the case of a file sync and share type of action, for example? And of course, then you've got access to the forensics too. You can open the file, you can see, depending on the channel, it'll highlight, for example, within the message body where that sensitive data was, or it'll show you the attachment in this particular case. In terms of visibility of unsanctioned or cloud application usage, there are technologies like this cloud access security broker type of thing, where they've built a database of tens of thousands of cloud providers and cloud applications, and they've applied a sort of risk methodology to it to understand how risky that cloud application is. And we're going through this right at the moment too, looking at our suppliers, double checking that they've got the right policies and processes in place. And this is exactly the sorts of technology you can use to assist just with that piece of GDPR compliance. Forget the flow of data at this point. But you're also able to see who's accessing those cloud applications and how much, and drill into a particular user or a particular application. And that gives you that overall risk score. And then, of course, using that information, you've got visibility of what cloud applications or what suppliers you're using and working with, those that are sanctioned and those that are not. And then you can work with the business to say, all right, out of all of those 100 applications we've discovered, only 10 of those are sanctioned. What else are you using that we're not providing a sanctioned version of, and how can we meet your needs, allow you to be productive, but in a way that we can manage the risk? And that's, then you have a small subset of cloud applications, and using that cloud access security broker type of relationship or DLP relationship, you can limit and manage how users interact and what data can be shared with those applications. And then the last one, just sort of wrapping up really, I suppose, is the need to be prepared to report an incident. And this is, this is an area where DLP and insider threat technologies can play a really important part. But the reality is it's all about the information you can get as quickly as possible to understand exactly what was going on, when, so that you can make very confident decisions and understand very quickly what happened, so that when you have to report it within that 72-hour period, you've got confidence that you've got the real picture. And the reality is often it's very hard to get a real picture, and it takes weeks, even months, to do a full investigation. So you need as many tools as you can to help you, or as much information as you can to help you bring that together. So again, just like the other sections, here's the specific sections of and articles of the regulation that really are applicable to this. But I won't spend time on that. You can read those at your own leisure. And again, I was, as you can see, do things in threes, I suppose. But the first thing is you absolutely need to use everything that you can to your advantage to get ahead of, or certainly get fast insight into what happened and when, because things will happen. And so there's been a lot of talk over the last, I don't know, 6 months, maybe even longer now, of analytics, security analytics, behavioral analytics, machine learning, all sorts of mathematics and science around the analysis of, even big data is used as a term. But it's about finding patterns, finding insight into what would typically be really difficult data to process, in terms of somebody as an incident responder to go through to see what really happened. So there's a lot of visualization tools and risk analytics out there to help you with that, and that technology has moved on considerably in the last couple of years, and just like any organization, I think Forcepoint offers these too, but we're probably the first to bring it into DLP actually at this stage, and it's really important because it allows you to sort of, instead of seeing 10,000 alerts when you wake up in the morning, you might see 12 cases. And in this particular example, you can see at the top window is a list of 9 cases prioritized in a risk process. So we're using behavioral analytics to process through all those individual DLP incidents and look for patterns and look for the level of risk that poses to the business. Is it a data theft incident, for example? Is it a broken business process? And so we've done a lot of that hard work for you, so that when you wake up in the morning, you've got a dashboard of where you should focus first. You click on each one of these cases, and behind them could be 1, 2, could be even 1,000 incidents that fall behind that. So it makes it much easier to sort of very quickly identify where you should be spending your time and effort. So that's important, because that'll help you prioritize your team's efforts, because you don't have enough people to do everything. So you've got to focus on what's going to make the biggest difference to the organization. And secondly, you just review what data and management data and information you have from previous efforts. So whether it was a personal data inventory, you can look back and see where that data was. If we've lost a laptop, what data was on it? Is it valuable? Does it fall within the need to then notify the authority, for example? Look at the past data incident flow reports to understand exactly what data is flowing and where this data flowed throughout the organization. And that will be behind these sort of cases. So here's some sort of screenshots really to help you understand what's possible with this type of technology. Of course, we talked about incident risk ranking and using machine learning to trawl through all those loads and loads of incidents to help build a very quick dashboard of where you should be spending your time and effort. And that's important. You can do that over a 24-hour period or a week, for example. You can also look at your users and see which ones are the most high risk in terms of the incidents that they've been involved in, and that helps you to target them for education, awareness, or whatever it is, maybe even to work with them to understand why this is happening, what's the broken business process, for example, behind it. And of course you can group them by severity as well. So you've got lots of different ways to look at that information, but the important thing is to sort of say it's quick to get going, so that you can start to react as quickly as possible, because within that 72-hour period, it's really important. This is a good example of going through a particular incident as an investigation manager or something. So in this particular example, we've got somebody, this is a user, Barbara White, and it could be anonymized at this stage, so you don't necessarily know who the user is, and you could invoke a process involving HR to say, we've got a risk, we have identified that this particular user is is losing data, we need to uncover who it is so we can now go and speak to them about what happened and when. But here you can see the source, the channel, the destination, the action that was taken. So was it blocked? Brilliant. We can heave a sigh of relief. Or was it in fact permitted? And then you need to look at what it was that they were sharing and why it fell under that. And then you can see here that this is a medical record actually for a particular individual. You'll also notice that there's a workflow piece too, because it's not just about seeing the incident. Now as a responder I might have to give it to somebody else to remediate. It could be that it's a quarantine file and it should go, and somebody's manager might be able to do that. So there's a remediation process, not just in terms of workflow and sending it off and getting it off the list of things to do to pass it on to somebody else to deal with, but it's also the ability to say, actually, I could apply a script that would encrypt that information. It's in the right place, but it's not encrypted, or it's in a risky place, but it's okay there as long as we do encrypt it. That removes it from the scope of the regulation, for example. And then the last thing I want to finish up on really is something that's a bit more than just DLP. We call it insider threat because it's kind of a combination of DLP and user behavior analytics. And the two come together very nicely to understand where your insider risk is and how big your insider risk is. But the reality is, as a responder, there's a lot of things that happen before and after a data incident, and understanding the data, and was it really personal data. In this particular instance we're talking about the General Data Protection Regulation, but it could easily apply to intellectual property that you have. Understanding the user and their behavior on the build-up and after that event is absolutely critical. In fact, often using this behavior analytics you're able to understand those high-risk users and their behavior that's building towards a data incident before the incident actually occurs. For example, I mean, there are three types of users. There's the accidental user who falls foul of a broken business process or loses it, and that represents around about 68–70% of the cases. There's the compromised user, that the user that clicked on that malicious link and is now owned by an outsider, and that's around about 10%. And then the rest of that, sort of 20-odd%, is the malicious user. So probability-wise, it's always going to be a broken business process or accidental. But the reality is that behavioral analytics of a user, not just of the data, is really important, because when a user clicks on a link on a malicious email, immediately something changes, and that's their behavior. And so detecting that behavior, or somebody who was a trusted user now has decided to become malicious, their behavior changes. You can get ahead of often where the data does end up leaving the organization. There's a lot more to it. We don't have the time to talk about it, but one thing I would like to say is that just like DLP, you can anonymize what you're seeing so that you don't, so somebody who's in IT doesn't see this information, which is going to be very important for organizations. But you can also capture what's happening on the desktop in certain situations, and you can see that before and after an incident, so that you can be very clear that this really is a broken business process, this really is a compromised user, or this really is a user that is malicious and is trying to take that data outside. This is a technology that we have been doing for over 15 years globally, but in Europe we've just brought it to market just under a year ago now, and it's for organizations that really are sort of looking to protect their intellectual property or personal data, and taking it to a slightly different level, I suppose. So with that, I'm going to wrap up, and I know I've probably taken about 5 minutes more than I probably hoped to, so apologies for that, Shona. But I don't know if we have questions, and I'm more than happy to take any questions that we have from the audience.
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation today, Mike. Really insightful. I'd just like to invite, I do have one question already, so I just want to invite the audience that via the questions box, got questions on any technology you've seen, anything specific within the GDPR that relates to data laws, please do take the time to jot them down now and press submit, and I will go through them in order. So the first question I have is from the audience is on the different methods of data leaving the organisation. On your slide you sort of mentioned different methods that data could be stolen or could be transferred. Which of those apply with GDPR? Specifically, are any of particular focus? I think the example is biometric data, and how would Forcepoint be able to capture that and stop that, or at least monitor that flow of data out of the organisation?
Yeah, good question. So I think the question is what really constitutes as personal data, I suppose. Is that what you're saying? So, you know, for example,
So what constitutes personal data, and in what format can it be? Can they?
Okay.
What's the word of it? Can the transmission of it be prevented?
Right. Yeah. So the first thing I suppose to say is there's always a risk of data being transferred without, you know, everybody or everything being seen. So there's always going to be a risk of an incident. You know, I think we all agree that that's going to happen. But you know, DLP alone is not the silver bullet. We talked about that, but it can be really effective. And I talked a lot about data that's hard to find. And so personal data, first of all, let's sort of just describe that for a second. That can exist in many different forms: physical, you know, paper printout, or anything really, digital, of course, pictures, because a lot of pictures have metadata in or have text on that might identify the individual. But it's any data, biometric, for example, DNA, anything like that, that actually physically can be mapped back to an individual is essentially personal data. And it's an individual that's still alive, I suppose, is another differentiator or a distinction there. And so as far as DLP is concerned, of course, we're focused on, well, a number of areas, I suppose. We're focused on the digital and potentially the physical, because of course there's a digital to physical conversion that happens often. So it could be, for example, somebody choosing to print a file, taking a screenshot and printing an image, or it could be somebody, you know, copying a file to a physical media. It's still electronic, but it's now physical as well. So there's lots of different ways where DLP could be used to understand where that data is flowing, and when it flows from, say, digital to physical as well. And of course there's other things like a security guard sitting at the office checking people as they leave, or making sure that people who are leaving with briefcases, you know, are aware that they might be taking with them personal data in the form of physical content as well. So there's lots of different control mechanisms and policies and procedures and processes that can be applied. But of course DLP is very much linked to the digital format, and at that point where digital gets moved to physical format. And so, you know, you need to be able to look for that data conversion either on the network through a print job or whatever, or even through, you know, on the endpoint device as it's captured and copied, for example.
Okay, thank you, Mike. So I have another question. What products at Forcepoint do you offer around DLP? So what functionality do you offer around DLP?
Okay, so I mean, actually it won't be a surprise that what I showed there was what we do too, of course, but we do offer a number of different areas. So from a DLP standpoint, we have a sort of a full suite of DLP technology. So we have endpoint DLP that can sit on Mac and Windows endpoints. We have mobile DLP to be able to monitor the flow of data moving to mobile devices through things like ActiveSync, for example. But we also have network DLP, so the ability to you know, look at data as it flows across a network, either, you know, directly across the network or through, you know, third-party gateway technologies, you know, like web or email security gateways. And of course we have our own web and email security gateways too that come with an integrated DLP module. And what you'll find with sort of gateway technology, security technologies, they do have, some of them have integrated DLP, or even cloud access security brokers, by the way, which we also have that functionality. They have integrated DLP. And when you talk to Gartner, a Magic Quadrant, you know, the guys that put the Magic Quadrant together, where we're you know, a leader, they talk about integrated versus enterprise DLP. And integrated DLP is very much a sort of simplified approach to look for easy to find data, you know, that often is very compliance driven, so personal identifiable information sometimes fits very nicely in that category. But it isn't what they call enterprise. And for us, enterprise, and for them enterprise, is to look for data more rigorously across more data types in more locations, because that's what, you know, the larger or the organizations that are deploying a full DLP project are concerned about. And I think for organizations around GDPR, that's the same too. So we have network-based DLP, gateway-based DLP, as well as endpoint DLP. We also have the Discover DLP piece, and this is a scanning technology that can go out and find data at rest, whether it's on the endpoint, you know, in network file shares, or in cloud applications like, you know, OneDrive, for example, or SharePoint Online or Exchange Online if you're using Office 365. And we have Cloud DLP, which is the ability to sit to the side of a cloud application and monitor through APIs that the cloud provider provide us, as files are put there, as files are manipulated and file shares are changed, for example. Again, we do that for things like OneDrive as well. And so we're able to do that cloud access security broker piece as well. And let's just finish up on that. You may or may not have heard, but we just announced the intention to acquire Skyfence, which is a cloud access security broker from the Imperva organization. And so that's something else that'll broaden the responsibility and the scope in terms of cloud application usage and the flow of data to cloud applications. Today we are able to run reports and show visibility of cloud application usage with our web gateway.
Okay, thank you. I have one more question. So this is regarding personal data transferred via email. As a lot of personal data can be transferred via email, does Forcepoint DLP software scan the body content of emails and audit on the transmission of that data out of the business?
Yeah, so our email gateway technology absolutely, integrates with our DLP. But just to be clear, our DLP does integrate with other people's email technology too, through a standard approach. And essentially, if I just home in on our email, because I think that's, that's the easiest one to explain how it works, we're able to create policies to say if let's look at all email going out of an organization, the message body, the title, or the attachment, and see if it does fulfill or comply or violate a DLP policy. So does it contain information I care about, for example? It could be intellectual property, it could be an image with text on, so optical character recognition is a technology we can use there too, and it could be within the body of the file or the body of the email, and we're able to perform multiple actions. And as I kind of described about the flow of data, it depends on what you're scanning as to what action you can take. Well, with email, there's a number of actions you can take. You can choose to quarantine that email so that you can get somebody through a workflow process to validate that really is okay to go out. You could choose to block it, of course, or drop it, whatever you choose to do. Or you could choose to allow it, but you could then pass it to an encryption service. Now, we have our own encryption service built into the product, but we also work with encryption providers, and we have a sort of more broader encryption technology. And there are different ways encryption works, by the way, as well. So you can have push or pull encryption. So push encryption is where you're pushing the content over to the recipient in an encrypted format that they can then decrypt when they want to, but they retain, if you like, the file or the content. And then there's pull, where we can encrypt the content, the message and the attachment, for example, put it into a location that the user can go and get via SSL, for example, so a secure web connection. They can then view the mail, or even view the mail, download the attachment if required. So there's various ways of sharing that file across email. But email is a great use case to be able to allow data to flow, but to be able to apply a policy around it.
Thank you. And that wraps up the questions that we've received so far. If anyone else has any further questions, please do pop them over. I'll give it a minute to gather questions. As you potentially do that, I just want to thank Mike for his time today in coming to present to us, and also thank you all for taking time out of what are, I know, incredibly busy schedules to attend today's session. As I said, we will have a recording, and slides from today's session will be available for you by the end of the day. I'll make sure I send that across to you. And please, if you could take the time to fill out our feedback survey at the end, that would be greatly appreciated. In the lack of any other questions, I just thank everyone for their time, and I hope to welcome you to future security webinars. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks everybody. Cheers.